Have you ever found yourself truly, utterly alone? Not just in an empty room, but in a place where the nearest human soul is miles away, where the only sounds are the sigh of the wind and the crunch of snow underfoot. Imagine that silence, heavy and pure, stretching endlessly around you, reflecting the deep, dark winter night. This is the kind of story that makes you check your locks twice before going to bed. So before the story truly begins, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me where you're listening from, your city and local time, in the comments below. And if you've had a similar creepy encounter, share it below. Maybe your story will inspire the next one. Now, dim the lights, feel the air grow colder, and try to ignore the shadows dancing at the corner of your eye. Let's dive together into tonight's nightmare. My plan had been simple: escape. Escape the relentless noise of the city, the constant demands of work, the digital static that had become my everyday. I craved silence, the kind that truly resets your mind. That's why, in the heart of a biting January, I packed my bags, loaded my old pickup truck, and drove north, deep into the Canadian wilderness, towards a remote, privately owned winter cabin I'd rented for 2 weeks. It wasn't just any cabin. It was nestled deep within a thick, ancient forest, miles from the nearest paved road. The nearest town was a good hour's drive away, a tiny speck on the map, mostly a gas station and a general store. This was exactly what I wanted. The drive itself was an exercise in shedding layers of urban stress. The paved roads gave way to gravel, then to a narrow, snow-covered track that wound through towering pines. The air grew crisper, cleaner, biting at my nose even through the closed windows. When I finally reached the cabin, it was late afternoon, the low winter sun casting long, blue shadows across the pristine snow. The cabin itself was a rustic dream: stout logs, a stone chimney, and a welcoming, if slightly weathered, front porch. Inside, it was cozy, a small living area dominated by a large stone fireplace, a compact kitchen, a single bedroom, and a bathroom. There was no internet, patchy cell service at best, and the only heat came from the wood stove. Perfect. The first few days were idyllic. I spent my mornings reading by the fire, nursing hot mugs of coffee. Afternoons were for snowshoeing, exploring the labyrinthine trails that snaked through the forest around the cabin. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the branches, the occasional caw of a raven, or the soft thud of snow falling from a burdened bough. I remember one particular afternoon, just 3 days into my stay. I was out exploring, feeling the crunch of fresh powder beneath my snowshoes. The air was so still and cold that I could hear my own breathing, sharp and distinct. It was exhilarating, a true connection with nature. I felt myself unwinding, the tight knots in my shoulders slowly loosening. This was the peace I had desperately sought. One evening, as dusk bled into night, casting the forest in hues of deep violet and indigo, I was nursing a cup of tea by the crackling fire. A blizzard had rolled in that afternoon, coating everything in a fresh, thick blanket of snow and muffling all sound. It was the kind of night where the wind howled outside like a hungry beast, rattling the windows just enough to remind you of the immense power of nature. I had brought a few books, but mostly I just wanted to sit and exist, to feel the quiet envelop me. I had stacked plenty of firewood inside, ensuring I wouldn't need to venture out into the swirling snow. That night I distinctly remember a strange sound. It wasn't the wind, nor was it the creak of the old cabin settling. It was faint, almost imperceptible over the blizzard, but it was there, a low, resonant hum. I paused, my teacup halfway to my lips, listening intently. It was too deep, too steady to be an animal. Maybe it was the wind vibrating something loose on the roof, I reasoned, or perhaps the old chimney creating some unusual resonance. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was just my imagination, a product of the deep silence and the isolation playing tricks on my mind. I even got up and walked to the window, peering out into the swirling white chaos, but saw nothing. The hum seemed to fade as I approached the window, only to subtly return when I settled back into my armchair. It was almost like a very low, almost subsonic vibration, felt more than heard. It was unsettling, but I was determined not to let it spoil my serene retreat. I pushed it to the back of my mind, blaming the howling wind and the unfamiliar environment. The following morning, the blizzard had passed, leaving behind a world transformed. Everything was coated in a pristine, blinding white. The sun, finally breaking through the clouds, glittered off the snowdrifts, making the whole landscape sparkle like a billion scattered diamonds. It was breathtaking. I decided to venture out again, eager to see the fresh tracks and explore the newly sculpted terrain. As I walked around the cabin, checking for any snow damage, I noticed something odd. There were tracks in the fresh snow, leading away from the back of the cabin towards the dense woods, but they weren't animal tracks. They were too defined, too regular, not like deer hoofprints, nor the uneven gait of a fox or a rabbit. These were long, slender depressions in the snow, almost like narrow, elongated human footprints, but without the distinct heel and toe. They were spaced unusually far apart, suggesting incredibly long strides, and they seemed to be coming from under the cabin itself before extending out into the forest. I knelt, my breath misting in the cold air, examining them closely. The snow was soft, so the definition wasn't perfect, but the impression of something long and thin was unmistakable. I traced one with my gloved finger. It looked like, well, it was hard to say. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen a creature leave behind. There are common animal tracks you learn to identify when you spend time in the wilderness: deer, rabbit, coyote, bear, even moose, but these were alien. My mind immediately went to the hum I had heard the night before. Could it be related? I stood up, scanning the snow around the cabin. Nothing else. Just these strange, elongated depressions, disappearing into the vast, untouched expanse of newly fallen snow. A shiver, colder than the winter air, ran down my spine. This remote winter cabin, this sanctuary, was beginning to feel less like a peaceful escape and more like a stage for something I couldn't comprehend. I went inside and made sure all the windows and doors were securely latched, a feeling of unease beginning to settle deep in my stomach. The fear archives of my mind were already starting to record. Even then, the subtle shift from tranquil solitude to a dawning realization that I might not be alone out here. This was only the beginning. After finding those inexplicable tracks, the peaceful solitude of my winter cabin retreat began to fray at the edges. The initial jolt of unease didn't fade. Instead, it settled in, a low-grade hum of anxiety just beneath the surface of my consciousness. I told myself it was likely an animal I wasn't familiar with, perhaps a rare wolverine or something similar, despite the odd shape. But the rationalizations felt thin, transparent. I spent the rest of that day mostly indoors, peering out the windows more often than I'd care to admit, my vision drawn repeatedly to the spot where the tracks had vanished into the dense evergreens. I kept the fire blazing, not just for warmth, but for comfort, for the flickering light against the encroaching darkness. The nights became especially difficult. What had once been a comforting silence now felt vast and oppressive, a canvas for every imagined sound. The hum I'd heard on the blizzard night, which I'd so easily dismissed, returned. It wasn't constant, but it would ebb and flow, a deeply resonant vibration that seemed to penetrate the very logs of the cabin. Sometimes it felt like it was coming from beneath the floorboards, other times from somewhere deep within the forest, echoing off the snow-laden trees. It was always too low to truly pinpoint, a sound that seemed to exist just at the edge of human hearing, more a pressure in my chest than an auditory sensation. Then the animal behavior around the cabin began to shift. For the first few days, the forest had been alive, albeit quietly. Squirrels chattered, ravens cawed overhead, and I'd occasionally spot deer grazing in clearings. But now it was different. The squirrels, usually bold and curious, seemed to vanish. The ravens were silent, their usual calls replaced by an eerie absence. I noticed the deer, which had been a regular sight near a small frozen creek about 100 yards from the cabin, were gone. Not just for a day, but for several days in a row. It was as if every living creature had been actively avoiding the immediate vicinity of the cabin. This was a significant detail for me. Animals are keenly attuned to their environment, and their absence spoke volumes in a way mere logical thought could not. I tried to dismiss it. Perhaps they'd moved to a new food source, but the sheer completeness of their disappearance felt unnatural. One evening, I was chopping firewood on the porch, the rhythmic thud of the axe breaking the absolute stillness of the late afternoon. It was bitterly cold, the kind of cold that bites at your exposed skin, but the work kept me warm. As I split a particularly stubborn log, a sudden sharp crack echoed from the tree line directly behind the cabin. It wasn't a branch breaking from snow accumulation. It was too precise, too loud, too deliberate. I froze, axe raised, my breath hanging white in the frigid air. I spun around, peering into the shadows of the forest. Nothing, just the dark, silent trees, but the feeling of being watched, an intense, almost physical pressure, washed over me. It was as if unseen eyes were boring into my back. I waited, axe still in hand, for several long minutes, straining my ears, my senses on high alert. The silence that followed was even more profound than before, a heavy, suffocating blanket. I slowly lowered the axe, my heart hammering against my ribs. My hands, despite the cold, felt clammy within my gloves. I gathered the split wood quickly, my movements jerky, and retreated inside the cabin, pulling the heavy wooden door shut with a decisive click. The cabin had felt like a sanctuary. Now it felt like a fragile shell. I found myself setting up a routine of checking the locks multiple times a night, peering through the small window slits, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, scanning the immediate perimeter. The snow was a perfect canvas for tracks, but after that first day, I saw nothing new near the cabin, yet the sense of a lurking presence only intensified. It was a maddening paradox. I saw nothing, but felt everything. My sleep became restless, fractured by vivid nightmares of silent, elongated shadows moving just beyond the reach of my vision. I started to question my own sanity. Was the isolation finally getting to me? Was I simply overthinking simple natural occurrences, amplifying them into something sinister because of the sheer quiet? I was an urban creature, after all, completely out of my element in this vast, untamed wilderness. Perhaps my mind was creating monsters where there were none, a psychological defense mechanism against the overwhelming solitude. But then I'd remember the hum, the strange tracks, the missing animals, and the unsettling crack in the woods, and the rationalizations would crumble. One afternoon, I was walking along the frozen creek, a route I'd taken several times before without incident. The air was crisp, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. It was deceptively beautiful. I stopped to admire the way the light glinted off the ice. That's when I heard it again. The hum. This time it was louder, closer, seeming to emanate from the dense cluster of pines further upstream. It was accompanied by a new sound, a faint, rustling, almost slithering noise, like something heavy being dragged through the deep snow. My blood ran cold. The creek was completely exposed, a clear sightline, but the sound was coming from within the dark shadows of the trees. I knelt, trying to distinguish the sounds. The rustling stopped abruptly. The hum remained, a steady, low thrumming that vibrated through the frozen ground beneath my boots. I slowly rose, my eyes fixed on the tree line. Then I saw it, just a flicker, a movement faster than any animal I knew. A tall, impossibly slender shadow, briefly outlined against the snow-covered trees, vanished deeper into the woods the instant I registered its presence. It was too quick, too fluid. My brain struggled to process what I had seen. It wasn't a bear, not a deer, not even a person. It moved with an unnatural grace, almost like smoke, but with a definite, dark form. My mind screamed, not human. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, staring at the empty space where the shadow had been. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get back to the cabin, to safety. But there was also a terrible, morbid curiosity, a desperate need to understand. What was it? What could move like that? The fear archives in my memory were now full, overflowing with a primal terror that eclipsed anything I had ever experienced. The cabin, with its sturdy logs and comforting fire, suddenly felt miles away and terribly vulnerable. I turned and practically ran, stumbling through the deep snow, my breath ragged in my lungs, not daring to look back. The image of that impossible shadow burned into my mind. I knew then, with a chilling certainty, that whatever was out here, it was aware of me, and it was getting closer. The sighting by the creek shattered any lingering doubts I had about my sanity. What I had seen was real, undeniably so, and it was something utterly alien. The brief glimpse of that impossibly slender, fast-moving shadow etched itself into my mind, a chilling confirmation that my peaceful winter cabin retreat had become a terrifying stakeout. From that moment on, my days were consumed by a suffocating paranoia. The cabin, which had once been my haven, transformed into a besieged fortress. I spent hours peering out the windows, my eyes straining against the dense forest, my heart rate accelerating at every creak of the old wood or rustle of the wind. My phone, with its pathetic 1 bar of service, became a useless totem, a cruel reminder of the world I'd left behind and couldn't reach. I couldn't call for help, couldn't explain what I was seeing to anyone who would believe me. I was truly terrifyingly alone. The fear archives in my brain were now permanently open, every new detail, every new sound adding to the growing terror. I kept the fireplace roaring, not just for warmth, but for light, for the illusion of safety it provided against the overwhelming darkness pressing in from all sides. I ate very little, my appetite vanished, replaced by a constant knot of dread in my stomach. The night after the sighting was the worst. I didn't sleep at all. Every shadow seemed to writhe. Every distant sound became a prelude to an attack. The low hum returned, louder now, a pervasive vibration that felt like it was humming inside my teeth. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a physical presence, a pressure on the air. I kept my eyes fixed on the windows, specifically the large one overlooking the front porch. I had pulled the ancient, thick curtains shut, but I could still sense it out there. The air outside felt charged, heavy with an unseen weight. Around 2 a.m., the hum intensified, rising slightly in pitch but still deep, like a massive engine idling. Then a new sound, one that froze the blood in my veins. A faint, almost imperceptible scratching, coming from the side of the cabin near the bedroom window. It was slow, deliberate, like long, thin fingers dragging across the wooden logs. SCRR rate. I held my breath, clutching the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. The scratching continued, moving slowly, methodically, towards the front of the cabin. It passed the bedroom window, then the kitchen window, until it reached the front porch. Each scrape was a direct assault on my nerves. I could almost visualize those long, slender forms, the same ones that had left those impossible tracks in the snow. The scratching stopped right at the front door. The hum vibrated through the floorboards beneath my bare feet. My heart hammered. I stood perfectly still, listening. Then a soft, almost imperceptible tapping. Not like a knock, but like something lightly pressing against the wood. Tap, tap, tap. It was too delicate, too precise to be an animal. It was intelligent. It was testing the door. I squeezed my eyes shut for a moment, trying to reassert control, to convince myself it was just the wind, a branch, anything. But the silence that followed the taps, the intense, unwavering pressure of being observed, was undeniable. This was no animal. This was something else. This was a direct, chilling confrontation. Suddenly, the hum reached a crescendo, a resonating thrum that vibrated through the entire cabin, shaking the mugs on the kitchen counter. And then a sound that made me gasp. A low, guttural shriek, not like any animal, but something raw and impossibly ancient, filled the air from just outside the front door. It was a sound of immense frustration, a sound of something utterly unnatural, utterly not human. It was a sound that belonged to the fear archives of primeval terror. The cabin seemed to groan under the auditory assault. I stumbled back, dropping the poker with a clang. I pressed myself against the wall opposite the door, my eyes wide with terror, utterly paralyzed. The shriek faded, replaced by that terrifying, pervasive hum. Then a distinct thump against the front door, as if something heavy had slammed into it, followed by another and another, each one rattling the cabin's foundations, making the windows flex precariously. It was trying to get in. It was enraged. I could hear splintering wood, faint but unmistakable. Panic seized me. I scrambled into the bedroom, grabbing my backpack, shoving essentials inside. My wallet, keys, the few remaining emergency rations. I knew I couldn't stay. I had to get out, even into the bitter cold, even into the dark. I crept back to the living room, peeking around the corner. The thumping had stopped. The hum was still there, a constant presence. I could see the front door now, and my blood ran cold. There were deep, jagged gouges in the old wood, as if something with immense, sharp claws had violently raked across it. And just above the doorknob, impossibly clearly, was a single, long, slender indentation in the wood, perfectly matching the shape of the tracks I'd found that first morning. It was a perfect, horrifying match. It wasn't just investigating, it was marking. It was telling me it had been there, that it knew I was inside. My eyes darted to the back window, the one above the sink. It was smaller, further from the main entrance, and provided a clear path to the dense, snow-covered forest behind the cabin. It was my only way out. I knew the risk was immense, stepping out into the territory of whatever was out there, but staying was no longer an option. This was it. The direct confrontation was over, but the fight for survival was just beginning. Terror was a cold, hard lump in my gut, but a desperate surge of adrenaline pushed me forward. I grabbed my thickest jacket, pulled on my boots, and with a last, terrified glance at the mangled front door, I slipped out the back window into the howling, desolate winter night. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to escape the immediate vicinity of that cabin, and whatever horrifying, inhuman thing was waiting in the darkness. I don't remember much of the next few hours. It's a blur of ice-cold air, stinging my lungs with every ragged breath, the deep snow dragging at my legs, pulling me down. I just ran, blindly, fueled by a primal fear that eclipses all memory of discomfort, of pain. The hum, that low, resonant vibration, stayed with me for what felt like miles, a constant, nagging reminder of its lingering presence. It was never truly gone from the edges of my perception. I don't know how far I traveled, stumbling through the dark, silent forest, driven by sheer terror. Eventually, through a combination of luck and what felt like divine intervention, I stumbled onto the narrow, snow-covered track that led back to the main road, and then, hours later, to the warmth and safety of my truck, buried under drifts of snow. I drove away from that cabin, from that forest, as fast as the icy roads would allow, never looking back. I never reported what happened, never told the rental company about the damaged door, never sought help. How could I? Who would believe a story like that? A creature that leaves strange tracks, a pervasive hum, capable of shrieking like something from a nightmare, scratching at cabin doors. No, they just say it was the isolation, a breakdown, a wild animal. But sometimes when the house is quiet and the furnace kicks on, I hear a low hum just at the edge of my hearing. Sometimes when the wind howls a certain way, it sounds like a distant guttural shriek. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still see that impossibly tall, slender shadow flitting through the trees, a silhouette against the snow. I check my locks twice every night now, sometimes 3 times. I avoid remote places, especially in winter. The wilderness, once a source of peace, is now a repository of a terror I cannot comprehend. It waits out there. Perhaps not for me specifically, but for anyone who dares to trespass into the ancient, hidden corners of the world. It's still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next